Hello, I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to welcome all of you to our regular Kaffeepause. Each week, we check in with Berlin-based journalists to talk about the emerging stories that are shaping the headlines in Germany. I hope you have a nice cup of coffee at the ready for today's conversation with Bloomberg Opinion columnist Andreas Kluth, who was previously editor-in-chief of Handelsblatt Global and a writer for The Economist. Hello, Andreas, and welcome back to our Kaffeepause.
Hi, Stephen. Great to be back.
It is good to see you. And before we went live, we had a chance to start talking about some of the issues that we hope to get to during our conversation today. But I am very much looking forward to talking about last night's triel between the three Chancellor candidates. But maybe before we get to that, I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of where each of the parties stood before the debate. Based on some of the recent poll numbers that I had seen, the Social Democrats, the SPD, were really pulling ahead. They're polling right now at the various polls between 25 and 27%, while the Christian Democrats are dropping. And in one of the polls that got a lot of attention, they had fallen below 20%. But they seem to be hovering between sort of 19 and 23% as you look at sort of the range of polls in the recent sort of 10 days or so. But the Greens have been kind of the most constant of the three. They've kind of settled into 16, 17%. And so the question that I have for you is whether you would agree that the Social Democratic lead under Olaf Scholz has stabilized, that the union of CDU and CSU under Laschet is sort of really running out of time, and that after the initial euphoria around Annalena Baerbock and the Greens, it seems as if they haven't sort of broken through yet, that they've sort of gotten stuck. What's your sense of where each of the parties are right now, and what their standing is?
You just summarized it perfectly. I mean, what we can't answer is whether it's now stabilized for the remaining 2 weeks, because what we've had is, by German standards, a stunningly tumultuous summer. Right? In the summer, everything got shaken up and flipped. For several years before that, we had very stable polls, especially during the past pandemic year. We had the Christian Democrats in a clear lead, the Greens in a clear second position, and the Social Democrats really nowhere. We'd all written them off, including me. And then the Greens had that quick blip, that moment of that euphoria, you called it, in the spring. The Christian Democrats had their internal fight over who would be the candidate. And then it all went south for both of those parties. And I believe just mainly 90% as a result of that, the botched campaigns of the Christian Democrats and the Greens, that's the reason why Olaf Scholz and the Social Democrats rose in the summer to take this lead. Now, it seems to have stabilized now, but some things are obviously, I mean, the last 2 weeks could have surprises. That there's one that we could talk about in a moment, but new revelations. But I would think in general we're there. It seems to be clear that Laschet will bring home on the 26th the worst result of the Christian Democrats ever, even worse than the very first one, 49, so the very worst ever. And that the Social Democrats will, that's not a good result they'll have either, but it'll be better than they got last time, and they were written off, and they'll be back. And the Greens, they will double what they had in the current Bundestag, but they were, in the spring, they were hoping to triple. So, and then we get the games out of that. But you've hit it on the nail, and I'm not sure what, in terms of, is it stable or not, barring a huge surprise, a huge news scandal. I'm not sure what each of the three could do at this point, either to mess it up in the case of Scholz, or to win it in the case of Laschet. I am not sure what there is. He's already pulled all the register.
Well, and so one of the things that we might get to later as well is the whole issue around voting by mail, and the fact that there are very high numbers of people who have requested ballots so that they can vote by mail. Those ballots are coming in. And so many people have already voted or are in the process of voting, and it doesn't really matter what happens in the next 2 weeks if somebody trips or if somebody's very successful in coming across.
That's right. I mean, but I don't have the numbers. I don't know as of today, for instance, how many people have voted by mail. But as you also said a little while ago, there are still undecided voters, and it's now all about those. In theory, it should be. It's all about those. It's also, from Laschet's point of view, though, about your base, just keeping them believers in you, from Laschet's point of view. Yeah, and that explains, I think, in his campaign tactic, which is slightly surprising, his personality last night, for instance.
Let me push you on one thing that you said, though, because you said that you felt that there had been botched campaigns by the Christian Democrats and the Greens, and that this has helped Olaf Scholz. And so I guess the question I would have for you is it more that the CDU and the Greens have not lived up to the potential that people had in them, and that Olaf Scholz was kind of the constant, but didn't really rise to the occasion either, but he's the sort of least bad of the options? Or do you think that he actually, because of the fact that he's vice chancellor and finance minister, and certainly has been in his campaigning, presenting himself as the force of continuity in an environment that really wants sort of continuity and stability?
I very much believe that since you give him those two options, that it's the case that he's the least bad option. Okay, he's been around for a while. We've known him, and Germans have known him because he's vice chancellor, he's finance minister, and he has always been. He's boring, he's dry, he's not inspiring, he has no charisma, and if he had a special talent that just made him succeed in the last 2 months. Well, where was that in the few years before? And where was that when he was trying to become the leader of his party? That's one thing we should probably get into later, is of the three, he's the only one who is not in the formal leadership of his party. And I think that's really important. That explains the dynamic of the debate and of the campaign, actually, because the question about him is, does he even control his party? And on the other German talk shows last night after the debate, what one of the big topics was again, or one of the charges from the Christian Democrats and the Free Democrats is, are you deliberately hiding your leadership because they're very unpopular? The two names are Saskia Esken, far left firebrand, Norbert Walter-Borjans, almost as bad. And then in the background, Kevin Kühnert, the younger generation, also in the Parteivorstand, also in the leadership, but not one of the co-chair people. And the question is, sort of Germany, if they were candidates, the Social Democrats would not be doing well. Scholz personifies that moderate, pragmatic, and competent thing, but I think only because he looks so relatively disciplined compared to Laschet, who had that unfortunate gaffe, especially during the floods, when he giggled in the background. That didn't happen to Scholz. Whereas Annalena Baerbock was caught plagiarizing and doctoring her CV. That didn't happen to Scholz. He's just played it steady and had enormous luck, but also it's not just luck, it's also savoir-faire. If the others keep making mistakes, don't interrupt them. And that's what he's done. But the thing for him is he's really had, I believe the attacks of the Christian Democrats are to some extent true. One way that the Social Democrats have unexpectedly risen is by literally almost hiding their leadership, because a lot of voters would rather not be reminded that Scholz was trying to become the leader of the party and lost when they voted internally, and lost out to these two, who are hard left firebrands and actually probably would like to have a coalition with the far left party.
And we'll definitely get to talk a little bit about that a little bit more, because I think that the left party is obviously a topic of interest. It's a topic that you had a large piece on this morning, and so I don't want to let you go without circling back to that. But before we do, one more point about Annalena Baerbock. I mean, you talked about the plagiarism scandals that she's kind of dealing with. I think that there might be more to it than that. I mean, she, even before that came out, while there was a lot of enthusiasm about her candidacy and about the Green Party, there were also a lot of people who were sort of questioning her experience and her ability to fill this role because she doesn't have the kind of governing experience that Armin Laschet has as Ministerpräsident, that Olaf Scholz has, having served as Ministerpräsident of the city-state of Hamburg, and now having served as Vice Chancellor and Finance Minister. So I think it's more than just some of these scandals around her that people have been questioning in terms of leadership.
Absolutely. I mean, she looks, shall we say, as lacking in gravitas compared to, and I do not think it's because she's a woman or anything. And obviously that's not an issue. We've just had 16 years of a woman as chancellor, but you're right. She has no experience, and she is around 40. She's about a decade and a half younger than the other two. That came across, and I think that hasn't helped her. An interesting question could be, but we can't answer it because would Robert Habeck, the alternative, the other Green leader, would he have been a better candidate? I think yes, but we won't know, and he might have made his own mistakes. He also is gaffe prone. I'm sorry, has slipped up a few times. He's heady and intellectual, and gets himself into trouble in that way sometimes.
So, Andreas, let's talk a little bit about the debate last night, because it was really interesting. Certainly watching the debate from afar, a lot of topics were discussed, right? Digitalization, climate, COVID, taxes. But one of the things that struck me, and one of the things that I've heard in a lot of the sort of noise around the debate yesterday evening and this morning, was there were no questions about Europe and the EU, about the transatlantic relationship, about Russia, about China, or even about Afghanistan, despite the news that's coming from Afghanistan. And so the question I'd have for you is sort of, does this tell us something about the candidates or about the moderators on Die Erste and ZDF, right? The two big public television stations? Or does it tell us something about Germany itself in the run-up to the election?
So in this case, definitely the latter two. So for once, I'm not a fan of any of the three candidates, but I have seen the three candidates actually do a pretty impressive debate on foreign policy, Europe and beyond. And that was hosted by the Munich Security Conference. That was like several months ago when Germans weren't really paying attention to. And on one of the web streamed and on one of the other channels, but it was not prime time. And I thought that was very interesting. That, in a sense, should be happening right now. So it was definitely the fault of the moderators and of German culture, of German society. And I've observed this in every election that I've covered here, where the first one was 2013. And it's always like that. I think in all, obviously in our country, the US is also a navel-gazing country, and and that's probably true of most places. But for such a large, central, important country as Germany, it is just mind-boggling how disjointed the debates are. Because the German public almost has no sense of the kind of debates that your listeners right now on this podcast are probably most interested in. They're not aware that for over a decade, all Germany's allies have been begging for Germany to take a leadership role. They don't even know what that means. Most ordinary Germans were not aware that their president at that time at the Munich Security Conference in 2014 said, yeah, we're ready, we should step up. they're not aware of the debate that Germany spends way too little and gets criticized for it on its army, way below 2% of GDP. So all of these things, they don't factor into the debate. Even Europe, which admittedly a lot of the Brussels topics, they're complicated, they're complex. It's hard to get around. I remember during the Euro crisis, just explaining that is hard. What is the ESM, the exchange, what are these things? So they don't show up, and I'm always stunned because those are actually the most important issues. I mean, yeah, the minimum wage, whether it goes from 9.60 to 12 or 13, it's not unimportant, but that's essentially, that's all I think they understand. That's all the moderators believe they can, they can foist on the audience, and it's very sad. It's a failure of democracy. The debate format doesn't work for German democracy anyway. But in that sense, the previous and last night's debate, they've both been just not good debates. The whole campaign hasn't been very good. Again, however, I will say that I did see the three candidates have a good debate, and it's Googleable, but it happened a couple of months ago, and it happened in an obscure corner of the internet.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, obviously, in an election season, everybody's more inwardly focused anyway, and thinking about the issues at home. And those were certainly issues that were covered last night. And if anything, I think that this is an opportunity for the public to sort of get to see the chancellor candidates live and in color. And I would expect that, given of the three debates, that the carriers of last night debates were the main television stations, that they didn't show Tatort last night, which every German, watches on Sunday evenings, to show the debate, that the viewership would have been quite high yesterday. And so this was an important opportunity for the Kanzlerkandidaten to present themselves. Having said that, there were polls that were conducted prior to yesterday's debate and immediately after the debate, to ask people what their perception was of the candidates, what their rating was. Olaf Scholz went into that in a very strong position with over 40% support from those that were polled. And Olaf Scholz, for Olaf Scholz, Laschet only had 19% and Baerbock 13%, so quite a bit lower. Coming out, Scholz was still on top, even though Laschet and Baerbock managed to win a couple points. But in your mind, sort of who won the debate? Was there a loser in the debate? And kind of what stood out to you about each of the candidates?
Yeah. So the most interesting thing is the way Laschet went into it tactically. Laschet, you have to is a kind of a jovial. He would be great in coalition negotiations. Laschet brings people together. He really does. He can kid around, joke around with anybody. He doesn't have hard feelings. They're all three probably nice guys, but he's a nice guy. He's not an attack dog. But he has been counseled, or he's decided that the only way he can salvage anything is to attack. And that made him, and if you think about what the effect of that is to German culture especially, the audience saw him attacking and didn't like him. So he was the least sympathisch, the least likable. That was also in the flash polls. And that was also true of the last debate, but he did it again. Why? Because he's decided, okay, he probably can't win anymore by making anybody think that, making people like him. He thinks it's too late for that. What he's realizing is, oh my God, my own supporters are running away from me. They're voting for the FDP now, or they wish it Söder or whatever. At least I want to get them, give them the sense that I'm still fighting, so that they also still fight. That was interesting. Now, therefore, he attacked and did not come across as likable as he actually is. And Scholz, of course, was hoping just to defend, and he did, but he got a bit flustered this time, much more than at any time in recent weeks, when he was above the fray and always very cool, very Hanseatic, very, very dry. This time, Laschet got under his skin a bit, and that one of the reasons was that just that day or the day before, there were some raids by prosecutors into the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Justice. He runs the Ministry of Finance, but offices that he doesn't directly oversee, and that's something about money laundering. And there's no, I've seen nothing to suggest that Scholz is going to get into any trouble himself. But of course, it's an issue, and Laschet immediately used it, and Scholz started getting worked up. And it's interesting whether in polls later this week, whether now people say, oh, he's not as cool as I thought, or whether whether they say, oh, well, I thought he was just a machine, a robot, and at least he's human, or something like that. I don't know. But he didn't bleed on stage. He warded that. I thought in general, Baerbock plays her part well, held her own in both debates, but she's not really going for first place anymore. She knows she's going to be in government. She hasn't really, therefore, she hasn't really attacked either of them. She wants to stay likable, not just for the coalition purposes, but for the audience. But I think she's given up first place, and she knows that she's going to be in second place anyway. And she'll be with one or the other as part of a three-way coalition. And she did that very well. She lets them fight with each other. She, at one point, she had the phrase, oh, this is what they're doing. They're still arguing about the past. I'm interested in the future. Mm-hmm. And of course, she's not been in government. The other two parties have been. So she's done that quite well, I think. So she's realized that she's lost compared to expectations in the spring, but she'll definitely win. She's there for the other, and she's probably going to ride that out now for the last 2 weeks, and it's going to work for her. So I thought she was there for more relaxed. She has less to lose. Okay, she doesn't have to take big risks. Laschet has to take these big and even ever bigger risks to move something. At some point, he could overshoot, but Scholz just has to avoid losing. So it's easier to defend in that sense, and I think Scholz avoided losing.
So it was interesting to observe that, and I agree with much of what you said, because it seemed more like a debate between Scholz and Laschet and that Baerbock was kind of on the sidelines. Every time she came in, as you say, talking about the future, but also with good substantive points. And what struck me is that she is now fighting for votes for her party, so that the Green Party with 17 or 18% of the vote, as opposed to a Green Party with 11 or 12% of the vote, can have a little bit more sway when those coalition talks start. Is that sort of something that you would agree with as well?
Absolutely. That's what it's about now. I mean, that's the analysis. They have given up first place, but they know they've got second, and now they want to hold it, make themselves strong, and also maybe start setting sort of like emphasis, points of emphasis already.
Yeah. What else stood out to you about the debate? I mean, there was lots of conversation about sort of climate and energy policy and how to sort of make that dovetail with Industriestandort Deutschland, right? With Germany as the center of manufacturing and industry. There was, I thought, a fair amount of discussion about some social issues and a minimum wage, although there was some criticism earlier today that there wasn't enough of a conversation about social issues. And of course, the pandemic and responding to COVID played a role. Each of the candidates said that they were opposed to a lockdown in the first debate. They sort of underscored that in this debate, but they also seem to indicate, gee, if the situation gets worse, we might, in fact, be looking at another lockdown, which is not anything that anybody really wants to hear. What were some of the other substantive issues that drew your attention?
I would describe last night's debate a bit differently. The first thing that stood out was that nothing stood out, was that the shallowness of the debate. We said that they didn't get into the big issues, that they got caught in the weeds. They stayed small, intellectually small. I mean, the other thing though, you mentioned some policy areas that were touched on, but if you remember what right off the bat, right at the start, what got them going, same as last time, was really these debates, and much of the campaign is now over the people who aren't there at the debates with those three, because over the third party. And again and again, Laschet is demanding that Scholz completely rule out a coalition between Social Democrats, Greens, and the left, which is the party that descends from the communist regime of East Germany. That's the bugaboo, the bugbear, the bogeyman that Laschet creates. And Laschet, of course, was ready for that. And essentially, the debates have gone about that. And in a sense, that's quite a technical issue. In other words, the coalition tactics after the debate. And it's strange that the moderators, they went there, but they allowed the candidates to go there. And that's where they had their first skirmish. Right. Mm-hmm. And I think then it was either followed by or preceded by the Laschet's attack on the raids in the finance ministry, and trying to, then they got into who's tougher on tax evasion and money laundering and stuff. And then they got back. And by that time, I thought they were all kind of exhausted, and the two men were riled up, and Baerbock waited, kind of hung back a little bit, and then came in the second half when she spotted her issue, which was the climate. Okay, mm-hmm. But she let them have it out on the other stuff, and it wasn't edifying. I didn't. It's my job to know about the issues that they discuss, but I don't think many people in the audience learned much about the issues. They just saw this play out, and I think everyone's realized, with Scholz will probably have it. And the risk is, because they keep hearing it, the risk is that he might have this far left, all left, red, green, red coalition. And do I want that? Is that too risky for me? And I think it's come to that. I don't think anyone's at this point voting based on whether the marginal tax rate for high earners goes up or down or something like that,
Yeah, Andreas, one of the things that I thought was striking in the first debate was how Annalena Baerbock came out from behind the podium for the closing statement and really sort of approached the camera and approached the audience. And it was interesting to see all three of the candidates do that last night, that they came out for their 1 minute closing statement. And Armin Laschet went first, and he talked about how he and the union are the ones that you can trust in the electorate. Annalena Baerbock was talking about the future, which has been sort of her, rote Faden. Her main point has been to say that this is an opportunity for real change and not the same old. And Olaf Scholz also, of course, touched on the future, but was talking more about the solidarity that was demonstrated through COVID and the floods, and respect, right? It was sort of solidarity and respect. Those were kind of the three messages that each of them were trying to give. How do you think that played out with the public?
The Scholz message of respect is typical, to me, I would say, Social Democrats before their recent rise, and it's also typical Scholz's. Ask yourself, who is actually against respect? It's just sort of, it's an empty phrase. It's wonderful. I'm for respect as well. I think everyone is. It is quite devoid of concrete meaning, and that's sort of he tries to be just stable. He tries to really avoid saying much at all specifics. Okay, so since he's just defending, that might work for him. I didn't find it so impressive. Baerbock was good, I think, last time, this time. But this last night, I would say, of the closing statements, we're just talking about the closing statements now. I thought Laschet actually had a good one. He's clearly rehearsed it a lot. And he kept it very simple, very short, simple words, and very, very few points. And the ones that stuck with me was he tried to say, okay, don't know if you remember the same way, but look, I'm not going to tell you how to speak or how to think, because of course with the other two parties, but in particular the Greens also, there's this whole thing of political correctness, wokeness, not as bad as in the US, but there is a bit of a culture war where a lot of people keep saying, oh, you can't say anything anymore. And he's saying, look, I'm tolerant in that way, you can think. And it was a little bit of a reminder, he didn't say the word freedom, but of individual freedom. If the FDP had been there, then it would have been two center-right and two center-left parties. Then it would have been a fair fight. But really, freedom, individualism didn't come up, and I think he tapped into that a little bit and became likable again. I mean, it's really the closing statement had nothing to do with the debate that happened before. It's just like, hey, I'm a nice guy. I won't tell you what to think or do. It won't be so bad under us. But the implication is with these two, who knows, central planning, you don't know what you're allowed to do anymore. They're going to ban everything, to be green, and then they're going to tell you what not to say. And we have this, genderized German language and everything. And some people are fed up with these excesses, and I think he's trying to be normal. And I think he did that pretty well.
So, that comment about sort of looking to the left and sort of some fear mongering that's going on is a perfect segue to talk about the piece that you published earlier this morning. It is not likely that there will be a red-green coalition between the Social Democrats, the Green Party, and the Linkspartei, but it is not impossible.
Right.
And so one of the topics of discussion in last night's debate and outside of the debate has been really around whether or not the Social Democrats under Olaf Scholz would enter a coalition with the Left Party. The Left Party having been sort of not as open to Europe and the European Union, to NATO, to the transatlantic relationships.
Wow. Hang on, not as open. I mean, you have to say what actually they're against.
So this is what I wanted to ask you to sort of draw out is where are the issues with the Left Party, and do you think it's at all feasible that this kind of a coalition will come about?
I'll describe the left and what the problem is first, but then we have to get to what is the mindset of the FDP, of the Greens, right, of the SPD, of the Christian Democrats after the election as they talk. How do they view their situation? And could red-green come about by accident, as it were? Because someone like Christian Lindner of the Free Democrats, as he did last time, in my opinion, 2017, does the wrong thing or walks away too early, overplays his hand, something like that. But to the left, I mean, the left descends sort of from a smaller West German Marxist part and a larger East German part that had many name changes, I think 6, that used to be called the Socialist Unity Party, and then the PDS, and then changed the name, and now it's called the Left. And for a long time, they were just pariahs because it was unimaginable to a lot of people. I think someone like Angela Merkel is in East Germany. I mean, that the heirs of the communist dictatorship should play a role at all. It's not as, I mean, it's a bit like, but of course, watered down, some part of the NSDAP in the 50s or something still being around and playing a role. And I think that's, for a lot of people, waned. But of course, the people in the party, they stayed, I would say, the loony fringe. In the piece, I call them the troglodyte wing of German politics. Right. And I think, so, and they were, of course, a protest party. And like the Alternative for Germany now on the right, where there are many similarities, by the way, they were always safe knowing that there'd always be an opposition. So they could say whatever they wanted. They were, many of them, not all of them, same as with the AfD, but many of them, not all of them, are extremist, would actually like to topple the liberal capitalist democracy that is modern Germany, and were therefore under, I think still are, under observation by the Constitutional Protection Office, the internal spy agency that was set up after World War II to make sure there's no Weimar ever again. And they are anti-capitalist. They have different strains and currents. They do not believe in the social market economy of Ludwig Erhard, that basically the softened capitalist version that the Rhineland capitalism that Germany has. They are anti-rich, obviously. They want to soak the rich, tax the rich. They are populist. They appeal to the resentments of or what they believe those are. That includes anti-Americanism and Russophilia, or a pro-Russian impulse. So if you read their party program, they actually always have and still do. They want to completely dissolve NATO and have a new security arrangement. They don't get specific about what that, but it would include Russia. Okay, so it is that kind of utopianism, but it is quite dangerous. They want to they basically demilitarize Germany. As you know, I mentioned it, the NATO allies all agreed eventually to spend 2% of GDP. And the US has for many, many years, I mean, going back to the Clinton years, but so nothing to do with Trump, said, Germany, you have to spend more because you're bad allies. And the left wants to take even more money away. They want to have no foreign missions of the Bundeswehr, of the army at all. Essentially, if they acted on any part of their program, Germany could not be an ally. And that would be very dangerous because it would have run. I mean, Vladimir Putin is very happy when they do well. By the way, he's being accused of hacking into German, doing a lot of this election interference. And his main target seems to be Annalena Baerbock and the Greens, because they're speaking tough against Russia. They found their moral compass. Okay, so I find that quite interesting. So you see, there are many genuine problems with the left. It's at the moment, I mean, who knows, if the polls still move, the Social Democrats and Greens might be able to do it alone together, But even with the left right now, because the left is, I should also say, the way we're all talking, it seems like they suddenly became strong. No, they're at 6%. The threshold to get into the parliament is 5%. Very few people want them around. Okay,
well, and their numbers
the smallest party. They should not have a role. I want them out of the parliament completely. But they'll be, that could also still happen. I would celebrate if that happened. But they now realize, we could decide this. So they may decide to become more flexible and say, NATO is fine, but would we believe them? I still think they're very dangerous because the government would not have they would have a slim majority of seats, and it would not be a reliable majority of seats. Any international crisis could topple the government, right? So that is the problem with the other two parties. They have wings that abut them. Yeah. That they also, a lot of even the Greens, but certainly started in their youth, by the way, Scholz did, as Marxist students of Marxism, anti-capitalism, all of that. Scholz too had a hirsute head of hair, and they later wizened. They became responsible. Okay, but there are parts, and so there are these paternalistic, as opposed to individualistic tendencies in all parties, but it's just concentrated in the left. And I think Scholz does not want that, but he would find it difficult, given his own party leadership that we mentioned, Esken, Kühnert, these people, and the left, to resist all the worst impulses on them. That's the danger of them. And he knows that. And that's why he personally, I'm convinced, does not want this. He cannot rule it out because he's not allowed to. The party agreed that because he's not the boss of the party, so he cannot suddenly do it. I think he keeps hinting that he doesn't want it so clearly that I believe him. Question is, what happens? And then we get into these scenarios. Could it happen by accident? Somebody has to make a coalition. It'll almost certainly take three parties. And the other parties might play their hands wrong too, and then it could happen by default.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's interesting, and you've touched on this a couple times in our conversation today, is sort of the the different viewpoints within both the Social Democrats and the Greens, and that there are some who are close to the left party, but that there are also in both parties the realos who are opposed to that extremist wing of their own party, and certainly to the left parties. So let's stick with possible coalitions for a few minutes, because we've gotten a couple of questions about the coalitions that might be possible moving forward. And I think that the current thinking is that a traffic light coalition or an Ampel is the most likely between the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Free Democrats. But it's not a given. There could also be a coalition between the CDU-CSU, the Greens, and the Free Democrats. And one of our viewers is curious about this latter coalition between the Christian Democrats, the Greens, and the Free Democrats, because the Free Democrats' relative fiscal austerity might be at odds with the financial outlook of the Social Democrats and the Greens, and that they might not be able to come together. And so the question to you is, as you look at a coalition between the Greens and the Free Democrats with either the Social Democrats or the Christian Democrats, which do you think is the most likely?
Right.
And then related to that, another viewer is curious as to whether a coalition between the Christian Democrats, the Greens, and the FDP might be viable, even if the Social Democrats come out as the strongest party.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, what will happen is if the polls stay roughly as they are, the Social Democrats will declare victory, and they will have in the way the culture is, everyone will agree that they have the right to begin Sondierungen, exploratory talks with the others. However, as you know, what happens that night still is all the others talk too. Now, one conversation, and these conversations might be happening already. A few interesting sets of conversations are the following. The Greens will get together with the Free Democrats, Christian Lindner, and say, what do we think about this? And by the way, like the one questioner mentioned that the debt break taxes and stuff, in every pairing, even between the SPD and the Greens, there are big points where you think it cannot work. Well, so obviously they all have to sacrifice something. That's just how it works. And if Christian Lindner of the FDP is smart, he knows that he's the smallest of the three, and he cannot, as last time, overplay his hand and ask too much. Okay, so I think he'll say for no tax rises or rule out a wealth tax, have a tax reform that simplifies it and maybe raise the marginal rates so that the others can declare victory. I think he would give the Social Democrat, he wants to govern, certainly. He would give them the minimum wage. I don't think he cares that much about it. Things like that, okay? And then it's about ministries. He of course wants finance or something weighty like that. But so if the Greens and the Free Democrats get together and say, look, we're also afraid of red, green. We have to prevent that. But they could together have an understanding as well. Let's make it a bit hard for Scholz and the Social Democrats during those talks. Those talks have to happen first and very publicly. They have to be seen to be happening. But the Greens and the Free Democrats could make those fail so that then there's an opening for the Christian Democrats to say, okay, well, that's not going well. Let us have exploratory talks. And that's how it could happen, because of course they have the majority. Mm-hmm. So the Greens and the Yellows together could be kingmakers in that sense. Last time, Christian Lindner, a lot of people will never forgive him for that. They almost had a Jamaica coalition, right? And he asked too much, but also he is a vain person, and he was grandstanding, and it was theatrical, and he walked away unnecessarily. And so now you could say, okay, well, does he now really have to prove it again, or is he even more under pressure to not do that? He realized that was too much. he's to me a bit of a wild card as a negotiator. I don't think he was shrewd and smart as a negotiator last time. I'm not sure how he views his situation. If it does come to the traffic light and he overplays his hand, of course, the purpose of the red-red-green conversation we had earlier is so that Scholz and the Social Democrats can say, well, look, now you're asking too much. There is another option. We'll go talk to that. I think a lot of the FDPs, the entrepreneurs who vote for FDP, if it came to that, they would really never forgive him. I think they see. I believe they want him to prevent that and to be flexible, and they would understand that if he doesn't get much of his program, how could he? He's the smallest of the three, you know. So that's how it shapes up. At some point, I expect at some, I mean, Laschet is very good at this sort of backroom dealing. If it comes to a difficult traffic light negotiation and the others have already got an understanding, the Greens and the Free Democrats, and they approach him, he'd be very open. And of course, he'd be very generous, giving good portfolios. And he knows he wouldn't have much, you know, he would be generous and he would like to make it happen. If that doesn't happen, then I actually expect that Laschet has to fall on his sword because he's just failed too badly and he has to make room. And then there's another fight in the CDU, but you know, everyone will know if it had been Markus Söder, they would have won, right? So then, but during this initial period, he may want to stick around to see how do the Free Democrats and the Greens behave? And so I actually think they control this. For instance, if Habeck and Baerbock privately, we keep wanting Scholz to rule out red-red-green.
Right.
Well, the Greens could rule it out too. And maybe they haven't publicly, but maybe they've got an understanding that's not possible. I hope so. I think so, because they, on Russia, on NATO, on these things, that is, I think, a non-negotiable, and they wouldn't want to do it with the Reds, with the Linke. And so they control this too. But we just don't know yet about the individual motivation and negotiating strategies of these people. And certainly, I think both Scholz but there are so many, this time, so many, it does not depend on what Scholz wants. It does not depend on what Laschet wants. It depends on all of them. And they may make mistakes.
And in the end, it will come down to the numbers. Right. I mean, it will be a mathematical test of which coalition options are even possible. And that will undoubtedly shape some of the negotiating tactics as well.
Although the ones we've mentioned here will be possible. I mean, I can't.
Right.
The only one that we've not mentioned that'll be mathematically possible if AfD won't be in one anyway is the Deutschland Coalition. But I don't see that as possible.
It does not seem serious.
Democrats and Social Democrats again being together with a third party. I don't think they want that, or anyone wants that.
So, Andreas, as we start to wrap up, especially since you were talking about Laschet and sort of his future after the election, if you will, and sticking around and seeing how the negotiations go. Or falling on his sword, and possibly doing both. And I guess the sort of big question for me is how does one explain or understand this incredible fall by the Christian Democrats? Is it due to the lack of a charismatic leader? Is it due to sort of the end of the Merkel era and just uncertainty, or is there something deeper? Is there a crisis in confidence in the party as this era comes to an end?
I think the explanation this time is entirely the candidate, and I'm going to defend it. But I know, of course, the reason you're asking, because there is the counter argument. After 16 years of Merkel, and for almost all of those 16 years, even before she, when she was just boss of the party, there was talk that, of her social democratization of the CDU, that she took the conservative core out, that the CDU stands for nothing. By the way, it's often in the past, post-war history stood for a little. It was called a Kanzlerwahlverein, a club for electing chancellor. Pragmatism, competence, we govern, okay? It never stood for that much, but there was this sense that, okay, under her, the party stands for nothing, and therefore now it's dissolving. It hasn't found its direction. That may be true, but then how do you explain that since the last election, the CDU was, with a few brief blips when the Greens, like for one poll, went above them, always well ahead, okay? Mm-hmm. That was true in those years too. And then how do you explain that in all the polls of who's the favorite candidate, when you include Markus Söder, who isn't a candidate, he almost was, he would always win. So it is clear to me that the Christian Democrats were clearly leading this spring, and Markus Söder still leads all the pack. If you ask him like that, who would you like as chancellor? If he'd been the candidate, there's absolutely no question they would have just simply won. There's the way he would have campaigned, and it doesn't matter that whether or not there's a clear ideological. By the way, let me just point out, I've read all the Wahlprogramme, the manifestos. The Social Democrats are in the same position. I was writing articles, we were all writing articles about them being completely lost. They have no answers, fresh answers to anything, any of the digital transformation, and they're the party of labor. They don't know how they feel about a universal basic income. They haven't grappled, and that was their problem. We were always used to them talking about it. And now they got a candidate that people like, and they're on top again. It has nothing to do with programs. No one's read their program, their manifesto, no one understands it, okay? So I have to say it's entirely the candidate, and that's why I think Laschet, if he doesn't become chancellor through these weird coalition negotiations, has to quit, and is probably done for in his political career, the main one.
So you've touched on Söder, that he might have been a better candidate. Some people think he would have been a better candidate for the union, but what about the person we haven't talked about at all today, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, who actually was Angela Merkel's sort of candidate as a successor? Do you think she would have navigated this period better and come across as a stronger candidate for the?
There are two questions that, as you're asking the question, occur to me. There's a big difference between who's the best chancellor and who's the best candidate. Mm-hmm. It is so. Markus Söder would be the best candidate. Whether he's a good chancellor, I don't know. I've had that conversation. There are things we need, but he won't. Not this time. Okay. Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer turned out to be a bad candidate, even before she was even the candidate. Just as party boss, she couldn't put her foot down. She couldn't get people. She probably would have been a good chancellor. She's grown on me. She very much as Minister of Defense. She is wise. She doesn't speak very good English. She was from a small state on the western border, but she's become very worldly. She really understands the big issues. She understands all the stuff earlier in the conversation we were saying, how Germany is part of a bigger whole, the expectations of the world on Germany and how that interacts. And I think she would have led very responsibly. And it's a pity her career ended as it did, but she also, I think, didn't want the hassle, to be honest. She's just out, but she was bad as a candidate, and that's just the way it is. And with the three, we don't know which of them will be a good chancellor. Based on how they ran their campaigns either. Yeah, that's a good point, Andreas. I want to thank you for that. So as our time really comes to a close now, the election, of course, is just 2 weeks away. There will be one more debate next Sunday. What are you going to be watching over the next 2 weeks, and what would you advise our viewers to pay attention to? It's I've put out a few columns over the summer on sometimes even humorous and on the level of debate. At some point after the election, we're gonna get into coalition options and maybe policy by policy. The next 2 weeks is just we wait and we look at that day's poll and see if anything is moving. And I don't think there's a September surprise anymore, unless this one little money laundering investigation blows up or something new comes. But I don't expect that. I think we wait. I think very little new substantive stuff will come out either in the debate there's one more next weekend, or in any of the, nobody's reading manifestos anymore now. It's just they're all repeating their talking points. you know it from the US cycle,
Mhm.
where we have to get through it, then these negotiations start. And I'm now watching the body language and the subtle hints that we've gone into some of them. How are the Greens and the FDP positioning themselves vis-a-vis each other? And I'm very much looking into the parties and the people that are not in the room of these triels. The triel didn't tell me much, and I expect the next weeks will be exactly the same.
Mm-hmm. Well, Andreas Kluth, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a very fast-paced conversation. We've covered a lot. There's undoubtedly more to talk about when it comes to the election, but this is an exciting time in German politics, and I want to thank you for making the time to share your insights with all of us.
Great fun, Stephen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks to our viewers for tuning in today. Of course, next Monday at the same time, we'll be talking about next week's triel and about what to expect during the last week of campaigning. To everybody, stay well, and I look forward to seeing you all again in person, hopefully at some point in the not so distant future. Take care.